Hello again, my name is Martin Goodman, and delighted to be the publisher of Barbican Press, which gives me the honor of publishing Richard's new book in a splendid new paperback. The book is part of Richard's tradition of diving into history and somehow inhabiting it. He walks there, he feels the heat, he smells the smells, he encounters the people, he inhabits famous people sometimes and goes inside their whole emotional world. And so here in this world we have Lazarus, who is not only being brought back by Jesus, he's been brought back by Richard as well, to live a life as a mosaic artist, a family man, somebody with complex relationships, complex issues, whole drama of revolutionary Israel. He's also very much a Jew. He's a Jewish Lazarus, which is indeed what the man was. So Richard is reviving that story through a lens that's giving us the Jewish tale of these characters that have their Jewish names as well. So we're going to investigate some of this story. We're going to hear Richard read. The event is co-hosted by us, Barbican Press, and Books and Print, LOST Bookstore. There's a link will come up occasionally that lets you buy Richard's books from that bookstore. You can buy all of them, but obviously many copies of the paperback are always welcome. And the event is going to be chaired as well by George Biggs. George is a colleague of mine here at Barbican Press, and he's gone his own deep dive into Richard's wonderful novel, and he's going to be asking questions. And then we will be opening it out as well, either to sort of type in questions, or if you can unmute yourself maybe, and then ask your own questions at the end.
Extract from the book. This is after Lazarus has awakened in his tomb. He's extremely disoriented and fragile. And he turns to his best friend for support. The worst part of this for him is he seems to have lost his faith because he has no recollection of any afterlife. And his best friend just happens to be an extremely charismatic preacher and healer, whom we will later come to know as Jesus Christ. But in my book, as Martin was saying, one of my goals was to give Jesus and Lazarus back their Judaism. So he's Yeshua ben Yosef. So I'm starting here with Jesus saying, the last time we were together, we argued about my plans to defy the priests. As he tells me of our disagreement, I recall growing fearful for his safety and pressing him too vociferously to refrain from challenging the authority of our temple officials. I'm about to apologize when he says, "Can you forgive me for taking so long to reach you?" Tears squeeze through his lashes, which summon my own. How could I not forgive you, I say. I need to hear you say the words aloud, he tells me. I give you all that you might ever ask of me, including my forgiveness. My throat is desperately dry again, so we retreat into silence while I gulp down some more water. At length, he stands up and goes to my window. I sense he needs to look into a world beyond our concerns. With Yeshua, there has always been the danger of his descending into too deep a chamber inside himself and never emerging again. On turning back to me, he takes a deep breath. Your sisters told me you died while I was making my way here, he says. I don't understand. You stopped breathing. Apparently, you were dead for 2 days. He clearly believes the truth in what he is telling me, so I do not laugh. When I taste blood in my mouth, I realize that I have nibbled away some crust from my lips. My old friend studies me closely. I expect him to speak within me, as he sometimes does when voicing his thoughts aloud might endanger or compromise us, but he says nothing. My sisters told you this, I ask? His eyes grow glassy. Yes, they said your fever worsened and that you became so weak that you were unable to move. Mia said that she was rubbing your feet with oils when she felt the tremor of your soul leaving your body. She checked on your breathing and there was none. Given that I'm here now, she must have been mistaken. Marta confirmed that you were dead. That's very hard to believe. Yet that's what happened. You were gone and then you returned to us. He nods as if no other explanation is possible. Echoing the Psalms, he says, As you know, I have always filled my quiver with the unlikely and the improbable. That's true enough, I think, and yet, are you certain? I ask. After it confirms that I was dead, I imagine the man I'd been only a moment before, standing behind me, observing me, unwilling to come forward and join me. So that's the first reading.
I think that's a fine introduction to the book for anyone who hasn't got the chance to read it. I think we'll start with some kind of more general questions. I think we've kind of touched on some aspects of this, but I think it'd be really great to hear what inspired you to write the book.
Well, this book actually has a strange beginning because one of my brothers died with AIDS in 1989, and that was a very difficult and traumatic period for me. And after he died, I had a dream, and the dream repeated several times, which is very unusual for me. And in the dream, I was in a mansion looking out across the outside veranda, and I saw my brother. And I thought each time I dreamed this, there's been some mistake. He hasn't died, he's alive. And I run out to see him and I talk to him. And in our conversation, he's very depressed and sad. And we both realize that he's lost a range of emotions, that he can only feel a certain despair. He knows he's not the person he once was. And at the end of the dream, he goes off into kind of an annex of the mansion, and I don't follow him. And this dream left me quite disturbed on a number of occasions and made me think of the story of Lazarus, where he's revived, of course, by Jesus, because what I later came to realize, it wasn't very obvious to me at the beginning, although it might have been, is that my greatest wish was to have my brother return to life. And so that dream started me on the project because I reread the New Testament and started reading all I could about daily life at the time of Lazarus and Jesus. And along the way, the project became deeper and wider. And the idea of giving back to Lazarus and Jesus, their Judaism, just obsessed me. And so that's how it started.
It's a monumental task, and the book itself is impeccably researched. It captures, I was most struck by, how it captured all kind of these cultural facets of Jerusalem in that time period. You've got almost like a clash of so many different cultures. Could you speak about how, what that process was like? Did you have a decent baseline knowledge? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I did have some baseline knowledge because when I was at university, I studied comparative religion. So I had already read the Old Testament and the New Testament. I was quite familiar with Greek mythology, Latin mythology and storytelling, books like The Golden Ass, things like that. So I did have a background which gave me confidence. I've always had quite a good amount of confidence that almost any historical subject, if you give me enough time, I can do the research, I can find out what I need to know, and I can create a realistic portrait of those times. And in this case, it wasn't difficult. When I wrote The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, my first novel, which takes place in Lisbon in 1506, it was extremely difficult because there was no internet. So I couldn't go on Google and enter keywords like Lisbon 1506 daily life. In this case, I could. So I would go to Google, daily life at the time of Jesus, and I got lots of books. And then I just order them and read them and take huge amounts of notes. And I'm gifted with having an extremely good memory. And that's very helpful for any historical novelist, because I can usually know where I found a quote, where I found a curious fact. You spoke briefly about being a multicultural society, which is one of the most wonderful things I discovered while doing the research, that Jerusalem and the Holy Land at this time had obviously the Romans, who were the conquerors, Jews who would have spoken Aramaic, Romans would have spoken Latin. It also had Greek colonies, so there were a lot of Greek speakers. It had Phoenicians, it had Nabateans, who were the ancestors of the Arabs. And so that multicultural aspect of the Holy Land became very important for me in the book. And it's embodied, I would say, in Lazarus, who spends his apprenticeship in the New York of the era, the big city with great avenues and the lighthouse, Alexandria. And so he has inside his own head this dual personality, one side Greek, Alexandrian, one side Jewish, speaking Aramaic. And so that part of it became wonderful for me.
Also, following on from that, so I'm interested to know about how this research process functioned, like with your writing. Was it a case of you kind of researching as you write, or was it getting all the notes you needed and then just going for it?
I believe in my books, the characters and the story come out of the research. If we think about it logically, imagine someone asking you to write a novel about medieval Florence, 13th century Florence. How could you develop a plot until you've understood the layout of the city, the important churches, who were the great philosophers and artists of the time, and what daily life was like, what the Italians ate at the time? And so that's what I do. I just try to find out everything about daily life, the kind of clothing they wore, how big the houses were, how did the temple in Jerusalem function? Although I'm Jewish, I didn't quite understand the importance of the temple as this center of Judaism back then, because that's where the sacrifices were held. That's where the priests, temple priests were. And so it wasn't until I felt extremely comfortable when I could close my eyes and see Jerusalem and see the temple and see the Romans and the Jews and the Phoenicians on the street and see what the shops looked like and see Lazarus working on his mosaic at the bottom of a swimming pool. When I could see all that, then I started to write.
Sure. And so you've touched upon that dream that you had. Where your brother had kind of lost some sense of emotion. This is something that you absolutely see with Lazarus. What kind of challenges did you encounter writing Lazarus? Because of course he's undergone an experience which none of us.
No one else has. Yeah, well, that was part of the excitement, writing about someone who's had a unique experience, and we would presume that this was a very positive experience for him, coming back to the dead. But in my book, it actually has negative ramifications. He has to reconstruct his identity after losing his faith and reconnect with his sisters and with others and with his children, who get a huge scare, of course, of having their father die. So I'm a bit like a painter, I think, in the sense that I use layers. I may have a preliminary sketch, but as I paint and add the layers and create the profile and the background and change the colors and maybe even change the whole composition, the picture starts to form and to become what it wants to be. Because when I start a novel, I know more or less what's going to happen in the first chapter. In this case, Lazarus was going to wake up in his rock-cut tomb, be very disoriented, and his sisters were going to say, "You were sick and you died," and he's not going to believe them. And so I knew that was the first chapter, but after that, I didn't know what was going to happen. So it's really a process of discovery and layering for me. And when I started, I didn't know that Lazarus was a mosaic artist. That became extremely important for me as well, because he's a very creative person and he dedicates himself to this. Although his first dream was to become a teacher. So, and in the book, it's explained why he was unable to live out his dreams and was forced to come back to Jerusalem from Alexandria, and why things in his family got so complex.
Another thing which I really enjoyed about Lazarus was, in many ways, we'll get to talking about Jesus, or Yeshua as he is known in the book, but there are many ways Lazarus finds himself kind of imitating Jesus at times, or serving a role that Jesus would. Right. I found that absolutely fascinating. It would be great if you could talk about that.
Well, for me, Lazarus and Jesus and Yeshua in this book are spiritually entwined. especially Lazarus becomes Yeshua's refuge, because Yeshua is this extremely charismatic preacher, magician, and healer. And he has all these followers, and everybody wants something from him. Some of the followers want him to lead a revolution and get rid of the Romans. Others want spiritual lessons from him. Others, and so the only person in his life that doesn't really want anything from Jesus except his presence and his affection is Lazarus. And he does this consciously. There's a part in the book where he says that the hardest thing is not making demands of someone you love. And that is the hardest thing. It's like letting someone live their life and letting someone go and be independent. And yet he knows, Lazarus knows, that this is the most important thing he can do for Yeshua, is be Yeshua's refuge. So when Yeshua is facing difficulties and stress and doesn't quite know how to lead his mission, or is torn between options, he can come to Lazarus and just receive that friendship. So the two have an immense spiritual bond that started in their childhood. And I think now that I'm older, I'm 66, I realize that childhood friends, if everything works out between them, do have a special bond. It's one thing to become friends with someone when you're 55 or 60, and that can be beautiful and important and special. But if you have the good luck to remain friends with someone you've known since you were 5 years old or 10 years old, there's a kind of shorthand. There's a way of speaking to each other that you don't need to say a lot of things. And Lazarus and Jesus have that shorthand. They can look at each other and know what the other is thinking. And they can simply touch each other or hold their hands and know what the other person needs. And I felt that for the novel, that friendship was absolutely essential, if not the most important thing about the book.
I thought the scenes where they simply have conversations were some of the most captivating in the book. It really, I think the writing encourages you to kind of like slow down and take in the moment.
Yeah.
I think because it's a moment of quiet for Yeshua, it encourages the reader to kind of take that moment of quiet as well. The Psalms were really important fixtures in their communications. They were like almost by the page. They would say Psalms to each other, and they'd find a lot of like solace in that. As an author, I would expect that would be very hard to know which Psalms to pick. Was it?
No, it wasn't that hard, because again, we're all very lucky now to have the internet and Google. And if you're looking for a quote, a specific Old Testament quote, there's the one I read just now in the excerpt about his quiver being filled with the improbable. So if you look up improbable or unlikely, you can come across the quotes that most fit you. And in terms of using them a lot, there's a biography of Jesus written, I think it's called Zealot, that I read for the book. And there's an aspect of it that I didn't particularly appreciate and didn't like, which was the idea that Jesus was probably illiterate. I think the author tried too hard to make it seem like there was this very uneducated Jew who became this important figure. And from my study of 2,000 years ago, it would seem to me that any young man, in particular, women were a different topic, but any young man who showed an ability and showed charisma that Jesus must have had, we know he must have been extremely charismatic to attract such a following, that anyone who showed these abilities would have been trained by the teachers of the day, the rabbis. And what would they have trained him in? The Old Testament. And so in my version, he's not at all illiterate. He knows the Old Testament extremely well. And this is in the New Testament as well. When Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, that is to fulfill the prophecy of Zechariah. He would have known about the prophecy of Zechariah. He would have known about the schools of mysticism in the Holy Land back then. And so that was very important for me in the construction of Jesus, to be able to use Old Testament quotes, because I don't want to do a spoiler, but in my book, Jesus and Lazarus are childhood friends who both studied with the rabbis. And both of them learned to rely on the Old Testament and to use it to express their ideas and thoughts.
The other striking thing about their relationship is that I think in many ways it kind of strays into a romanticness in some ways. He compares his love for Jesus like the love Mary Magdalene has for Jesus, or the love his sisters have for Jesus.
To me, there's no physical barrier between Yeshua and Lazarus. A lot of time when there's a friendship between men in our current modern world, and maybe that's changing for your generation, George, there was always a physical barrier between at least heterosexual men or heterosexual and gay men that couldn't be crossed very easily, maybe unless people were childhood friends again. And maybe that's one important thing about being childhood friends. But in my book, there's a scene I remember where Yeshua is exhausted and sleeping, and Lazarus places his hand above Yeshua's body, but doesn't touch him. He maintains a distance in order to feel that amazing tension of wanting to touch someone you love and not doing it. And so for me, I also have to say that I try to be accurate to the time period. So in researching particularly Greek ideas about sexuality and Roman ideas about sexuality, we of course come upon the notion that they didn't have the same categories we do. I know that for some contemporary people that's difficult to understand, that they didn't divide the world into heterosexual and homosexual and bisexual, and maybe now with non-binary and those ideas, people are understanding a little bit better the fluidity that came with Greek and Roman culture. And so I tried to reflect that in the book. And I tried to reflect the idea that for the Greeks, the Romans, and the people back then in this multicultural society, having sex would not have been sinful. And so there's scenes even where Lazarus goes to a brothel. And I haven't gotten into any trouble about that, except for one reader in Canada who was offended by the idea that, this biblical character would have gone to a brothel. But back then, in a Roman colony, it would have seemed perfectly normal for people to avail themselves of that possibility.
I thought we can move on to some questions about Jesus. As I said before, I think these are the questions everybody's waiting for. What was it like writing Yeshua?
At first, it was difficult, but then something saved me. Because when you're writing a book like this, historical novel with a famous, some people believe Messiah, at the very least, famous prophet and preacher and magician, you come upon 2,000 years of Christian iconography. So you have to deal with that. You cannot not deal with the New Testament and all the paintings of the most famous painters throughout history, whether it's the Sistine Chapel or, you have to deal with it. And then I had a breakthrough, which was in my book, I would not refer to them by their Christian names. And that freed me completely, because Yeshua ben Yosef isn't Jesus Christ. And Eliezer ben Natan isn't Lazarus. They're just who they were. And the same applied to all the characters in the book. Miriam, the mother of Jesus, for me, she wasn't the Virgin Mary. She was Miriam, the mother of Yeshua. And so I could explore their interactions simply as people. It may sound a little humorous, but exactly the opposite happened in Hollywood, where the Hollywood movie moguls, the studio bosses, they took away the Jewish names from their stars and made them acceptable to the American populace. So I wrote down some here. Izzy Dembski became Kirk Douglas because Izzy Dembski isn't going to star in a Western. And Betty Persky wasn't going to be a seductive, long-legged, gorgeous woman, so she became Lauren Bacall. And so you realize that these names have an extremely strong resonance with people. And that saved me. And I think it also frees the readers, because amazingly enough, I've had no criticism from faithful, pious Christian readers about the book. I think they understand that I was writing a very serious book about mysticism and friendship, and what it would be like to have your best friend be this incredible spiritual leader. What kind of responsibility that would imply to you.
I was really fascinated about the depiction of Mary and the other Mary Magdalene.
Sure.
Both of these women, I think, have an awful lot of agency in this book, and they're very well respected as kind of human beings. Was that kind of a mission objective of kind of reclaiming Mary Magdalene and Yeshua's mother as people?
Yes, it was very important for me, not only from the point of view of a novelist. You always want your characters to be real people, and for the reader to be able to relate to them, not as an icon or a goddess, but as people with all the range of emotions that we all have. But it also became important for me because I could see how Lazarus would become furious that after his best friend's death, this woman whom he's known since his childhood, Miriam, is treated as the mother of a god, or a goddess herself, is venerated, and how upset he would be about that, especially in Judaism, where we're not permitted to venerate idols. And so to see his best friend's mom, whom he's known since he was a kid, and it wasn't always a good relationship, but they've grown to love and respect each other, to see her treated as an idol would infuriate him, just as it infuriates him that people refer to Yeshua as a king or as a god. That wasn't what, in his mind, what his best friend was about. He said, there's a part in the book where he says that where he's angry about the virgin birth, because at that time, 2,000 years ago, people said the same thing about Alexander the Great, that he was born from a virgin. It was a technique that was used to tell people that this person was extremely powerful and special and close to being a god. Well, he's furious about that because for him, Yeshua was much more important than Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a general. He was a mass murderer. He conquered territories. That wasn't what Yeshua was about. Yeshua wanted to usher in a new spiritual epoch, a new era in which there would be no sacrifices, in which there's even a point where he says, if the Romans are willing to treat us as brothers, then I don't need for them to leave the Holy Land. There's no need for them to go. And so, it was extremely important, especially for those two women, to become real people. And of course, Lazarus relates to Mary Magdalene because he believes that they love Yeshua in the same way, in the same deep spiritual, physical way.
There's a sense of mourning from Lazarus about the way Yeshua's death and the aftermath has kind of changed things, the legacy of what
That's right.
Yeshua wanted. Well, I find it really interesting, but I won't say any more because you should read the book. It kind of goes into it a lot more deeply. What I was struck most by Jesus was his kind of like cool charisma. He's a very emotional person, but very kind of collected. Did you have a specific approach in making Jesus seem kind of so personable and so kind of otherworldly as he does? Was there a specific approach?
Well, I started with the idea that he must have been this extremely charismatic individual who attracted all sorts of followers. And that's not an accident. All of us have met some very special people who, when they walk into a room, your eyes go to them. Nelson Mandela was that kind of personality. Now, what is it about them? And in talking to people about this phenomenon, I came to the conclusion that one of the things that these extremely powerful people do, consciously or not, is when they're talking to you, they make you feel like you're the only person in the world. They're not looking at their phone. They're not checking their email. They're not looking around at the birds flying in the air. They're speaking to you. They're listening to you. And that in itself, the act of being listened to and observed, is extremely important. And it's what people want. People want to be seen. They want to be heard. They don't want to be placed in between phone calls or emails. And so that became a conscious part of Yeshua for me, that everyone feels that when they're with him, they are the most special person in the world to him.
It's obviously a kind of religious story, a spiritual story, but there is, of course, there's a political slant. Yeshua wants to bring about a new epoch, as you said, but he's almost in kind of, as a Jew himself, and as a person who's trying to invigorate the Jewish population to kind of uprise and kind of live alongside instead of under the Romans.
Right.
There's definitely the social uprising element. Was that something that just emerged because of the way that you were reading the New Testament and your research? Was that that construction of Jesus as a bit of a political figure as well something that you intended to do?
Well, from the New Testament, we get the feeling that Jesus was more than a spiritual leader, that there was a political element to his mission. When he chases the merchants out of the temple, when he rides through Jerusalem, there's an element of him defying the power of both the temple priests and the Romans. And obviously this was extremely dangerous for him and ended in the tragic way that we all understand. So yes, I felt like he was a political leader and he was a spiritual leader. He was both. And I didn't want to shortchange one in favor of the other. So in the book, he's obviously a mystic. He obviously has these special relationship with, he can rise up into what I call the Hekel, I can't remember the term, but the palace of the Lord, which was a term used back in Jewish mysticism in the first centuries. So he's both, and that's part of what makes him amazing and special, and part of what got him into trouble. And he obviously felt that was what the Holy Land needed at the time.
And one thing I was really interested about was the Jewish infighting. So there is obviously a massive conflict with Annas, the Jewish high priest, which, as I understand it, although I'm no expert, is actually in the Bible. But I was interested to see how you found learning about kind of Judaism as a Jewish person yourself at that time.
Right. Well, what I didn't realize is that ancient Judaism was in some respects different. Well, there was a lot of similarities to present day Judaism. We have the same festivals and things like that. But I didn't quite understand how the temple was such a central focus. It really was the geographical center of all of Judaism, because that's where the temple priests were, the high priest was. They were extremely powerful. That's where the sacrifices would be made. People would bring their animals to be sacrificed. That was their cult offerings were extremely important. There were synagogues, small synagogues, but they were much less important than they are now. After the destruction of the temple, first in 500 and whatever it was BC, and then by the Romans, Judaism lost its geographical center, which is another extremely interesting topic that Jesus mentions when he's challenged by Annas, and Annas says, I believe says, well, what will happen if the Romans destroy the temple? And Jesus says, we will still have a center. We will have the temporal center. We will have the Sabbath. The Sabbath will become the center of our religion. And that's exactly what did happen. There's the mystical idea of our week being sort of like a circle that comes back to the Sabbath each week. And there was a tradition where people would even talk differently on the Sabbath and walk differently and behave differently. And so I had to learn about ancient Judaism and its differences from the current practices. And I love doing that. Just a quick word about the research. I love it. It's so exciting for me to go back and discover what daily life was like, how people thought differently back then, about the sexuality, about their religion, about other people, about multiculturality. You know, we have this whole idea that multiculturality was invented, you know, in the 20th century by people. And then you read about the Middle East and you realize that that's completely false, completely untrue. And so the research for me, as I say, the story comes out of the research. And Jesus as a spiritual leader and politician came out of my readings of the Old and New Testament and all the other books.
Brilliant. I'll ask one more question before we open it up.
Okay.
It's a slightly less loaded question, I think. I was fascinated. There's an awful lot of wordplay in the book. So you know, difference between Latin and Greek and Amharic. I wanted to hear about your theory of that, because I'm imagining that takes a lot of knowledge to be able to string these very similar words together.
Well, it does take a lot of work, especially if you don't read ancient Greek or know Latin very well. But it's something I love to do. I love words, you know, I love little things that change the meaning of everything. And when I discovered particularly that in Greek and Roman times, people started writing graffiti. I mean, there was graffiti on all the monuments and the tables, and so this brought up the idea of people using language in comic ways and in clever ways and in satirical ways. And so that's what I do. I would make lists of ancient Greek words, you know, 500 ancient Greek words, 200 ancient Latin words, or Aramaic words, and then I would play with them like a poet would, and I would see what I would come up with. And then if it made sense, you know, you can do all these clever things, of course, but if they don't make sense in the context, if they don't further the story, you can't use them. Because one kind of writing that I really dislike is overly clever authors who are always bringing the attention back to their own intelligence and their own cleverness and their own sensitivity. I try to avoid that. So if there was wordplay that made sense in context, like there's graffiti on a table in a tavern that Lazarus visits with his son, then I use it. But if it's not going to further the story, or if it's going to stand out and make readers say, oh, isn't Richard Zimler clever, then I eliminate it.
Yeah, I think it's probably prime time to open up to any questions if there are any.
I'd like to jump in with one research one. When I was interviewed Stephen Saylor once, asking him about his research of ancient Rome, he used the internet because there you could actually walk around the streets of ancient Rome and go inside buildings. Were you able to do that around ancient Jerusalem?
Not so much in terms of a 3D encounter on the internet, but I was able to get a lot of maps and books and stylized drawings of the city. And with those, I was able to form a pretty good idea of where everything was, you know, where the theater was. You know, we tend not to think of Jerusalem as having a Roman population, which is a bit strange, but, you know, they had a Circus Maximus and they had a theater and they had all that any Roman fairly large city would have had. So I was able to do that, but not in a 3D way. I suspect there's a lot more done about Rome than ancient Jerusalem.
And I was interested in one thing you said is that I don't want to put in a spoiler here. I thought it was interesting talking about spoilers when you're writing about the most famous story on earth. So what was your sense of having this story that everybody knew, yet you wanted to keep the drama going, so it stayed exciting?
Well, I felt I could keep it very fresh by concentrating, as you said, Martin, on the friendship between the two men and the relationships between the people. The family relationship is extremely important in the book. We know from the Gospel of John that Lazarus had two sisters. And so his relationship with both his sisters, he has a great relationship with Mia, the older sister, and a terrible relationship with Martha, because she didn't learn to read and write, and she blames Lazarus for that, because at the time the tradition in Jewish families was to only teach girls how to read and write if there were no boys, if there were no sons. So when Lazarus is born, the father stops teaching Martha how to read and write. And so this creates a huge friction between the two. And so I felt that those family relationships would keep the reader going. And then I felt at the end of the book, after the crucifixion, it becomes a page turner of sorts in which Lazarus is forced to flee because he's caught up in the plot to murder Jesus, because Lazarus was the proof that Yeshua was a miracle maker. Here's this guy I brought back from the dead. So Lazarus flees with his 2 children. I won't do a spoiler, but someone else goes with him, and ends up, again, I won't do a spoiler, but ends up in Greece. And so for me, it was really those last 120 pages of the book were completely new and had nothing to do with any of the New Testament stories. And for me, gave it an energy and a purpose and a passion that I hope the reader would pick up on.
Yeah, I hope readers do. As a publisher, you're invited to go and meet those last 120 pages and devour them.
I want to say hello to Richard. It's Robert and Olivia here.
Hi.
Great to be seeing you.
Thank you.
So fascinating. I share your interest in that period of Jerusalem at that period. I want to ask you a question of pronunciation. First of all, I'm so glad you called Jesus by his real name. But you say Yeshua and George says Yeshua. I've been saying Yeshua to myself. But do we know which is correct?
I am not the expert.
I'm sure my rabbi friends would tell you what they believe is correct, but we can ask them afterwards. I just say Yeshua because it sounds more natural to me to say it that way.
Like you, Richard, I like finding out what the words really mean.
Yeah.
And you get all kinds of crazy things that you discover, but you also discover a deeper meaning.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, it's a losing battle because we're never going to change it from being Jesus Christ, but I understand exactly why you would want to. And of course, all those Jewish and Aramaic names meant something back then. And I use that in the book where Jesus's name, Yeshua, is referred to by its real meaning and its importance in a dream that Lazarus has. Again, I don't want to give a spoiler, but the names do have importance in the book that we've unfortunately lost when we speak English or French or Italian or many of the modern languages.
So, of course, to put Yeshua into English, it would be more correct for us to call him Joshua, which is a closer word to the original Aramaic, as you know. But what happened was that it became Jesus in Greek, then that became Jesus in Latin because they have an US ending instead of an OS ending.
Yeah.
And then we ended up with Jesus in English. But Joshua is much closer to Yeshua.
Sure. Well, the important thing for me was to break through the barrier of being so familiar with these names that we can't accept them as real people. So that's why I chose those names, to break through the 2,000 years of Christian iconography.
Chris asks, how easy is it to leave your characters behind, especially after that much research, to make space for new characters in books?
Thank you, Chris. I have an advantage over readers, which is after I've lived 2 or 3 years with the characters of the book, in this case with the characters of the New Testament, they inhabit me and I inhabit them. So even after I finish the novel, I sense their presence still in me. I mean, I'm not crazy. I'm not, that I know of, I'm not schizophrenic, or I don't have any sort of identity disorder, but I can still feel Lazarus inside me, and I still feel Yeshua inside me. And there are certain scenes in the book that I still feel taking place inside me. It's like there's no past. If you're an author, you get very lucky because you don't have to close the door on the novel. You can close the door, but still inhabit it. I know that sounds strange, but other authors who are watching will understand me, that you can still live with that experience for the whole rest of your life.
Len asks, did your dreams about your brother stop when you were writing the book, or did they change?
You know, I didn't write the book till many years later. My brother died in 1989, and I couldn't write about that then. I didn't have the energy. After he died, I couldn't do anything for 6 months, and I wasn't writing novels then anyway. I didn't start on this project until after my mom died in 2006, and the dream came back to me one more time. And so that started me thinking about that. And I've never had the dream since. So probably whatever I needed to work out psychologically, particularly this wish that my brother would come back to life. Because when someone dies and they're very young, like Jesus, they're 33, 34, 35 years old, it does play havoc with your mind. You start to question the justice of life, and you always think about your own mortality. I think I've had death hovering above my head ever since my brother's death, and it's always there, and it'll never go. It's like there's a before he died and an after he died, and I was able to use that in the novel because for Lazarus, excuse me, there's a before Yeshua's death and an after, and they're completely different. So I hope other people don't have that experience, but that's the way it is.
Is there any chance of you returning to ancient Jerusalem again as a writer?
There is. I have no strategy for my career. I know I should, because I should probably be writing about vampires or zombies or something that's very popular, but I'm unable to do so. If some story comes to mind that I cannot stop myself from thinking about it, because I have a very obsessive personality, if it keeps me up at night, if it gives me insomnia, if I dream about it, if I start doing the research, if I start ordering books on the internet, then yes, I'll write about ancient Jerusalem again. But I can't predict it. I have no idea what's going to happen with my career. Okay.
I think we should all do a little virtual round of applause for wonderful Richard and his insight and eloquence.
Thank you. And just before we go, I want to express my thanks to Martin for doing such a beautiful edition of the book. At first, when he showed me the image of the two hands gripping, I thought, no, that's not going to work, which just shows you how wrong the author of a book can be. I suggested we put the mosaic behind it. He agreed, and I think the cover came out fantastic, beautiful, something I never would have thought of. So that's why it's always good to have 2, 3, 4 people thinking creatively about a project. So thanks to Martin for publishing the book and for having a beautiful cover and for helping with this Zoom. Thanks to George, whom I met for the first time today. Thanks to all my friends and readers for joining in. I see lots of old friends here, and I'm extremely grateful for having so much support all over the place and for being able to keep your attention for an hour. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Obrigado, Richard. And thanks very much, George. I really enjoyed your conversation. It was wonderful to sit back and get a fresh perspective on the novel. So many thanks for that. And thanks everyone for attending and being there.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. And
thank you, everyone.
Yeah. And please read the book and tell your friends and buy them presents.